Hello, 8th grade ELA students. This is Miss Tolman. I will be reading through your lessons for you. Today's video is Unit 3, Lesson 5. We're talking about the narrative. We are still talking about the writing process, and because we are still in Unit 3. Today we have a good chunk of vocabulary, so please have your notes ready to go, and we will get started. So our lesson 5 is the narrative. Our vocabulary starts with conflict, which is the problem in a story. It can be man versus man, man versus nature, man versus self, or man versus society. First person point of view. The story is told by one of the characters in the story. Narrative, it's a story. It can be fictional or nonfiction. Objective. So the narrator tells the story without describing the thoughts and feelings of any characters in the story. Plot. The events that happen in the story from beginning to end. Includes exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. Point of view is the perspective from which the story is told. Subjective. It's when the narrator describes the inner thoughts and feeling of one or more characters. Third person, limited point of view. The narrator of the story reveals the thoughts and feelings of just one character in the story. Third person, omniscient point of view. The narrator tells the thoughts and feelings of all the characters in the story. Now we're going to get into narrative writing. So narrative writing is the first type of writing you will practice using the writing process is narrative writing. A narrative is another word for a story. It can be fictional or non-fictional. As discussed earlier in the unit, narrative writing does not require much outside research, unless you need background information to make your character's setting and plot more realistic. The majority of your planning will involve brainstorming, writing down ideas as they come to you, and organizing your ideas using a format that makes sense to you. Before you begin writing, however, we will discuss the components and structure of a narrative. Our first point is point of view. So the point of view of a narrative indicates who is telling the story. A story can be told from the perspective of a character in the story or from the viewpoint of an outside narrator. First person point of view means that the story is told by one of the characters in the story, and the reader sees everything that happens in the story from the point of the view of that character. This style of writing is recognizable by the use of the pronoun I. The character telling the story often talks straight to the reader, and the reader and storyteller have access to the same information. In the following example from The Adventure of Speckled Band, a Sherlock Holmes story by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the first-person narrator is Holmes' friend, Watson. Notice that Watson narrates the story using the pronoun I, and we see his perspective of the events of the story. I called upon my friend, Mr. Sherlock Holmes, one day in the autumn of last year, and found him deep in conversation with a very stout, florid-faced, elderly gentleman with fiery red hair. With an apology for my intrusion, I was about to withdraw when Holmes pulls me abruptly into the room and closes the door behind me. "You could not possibly have come at a better time, my dear Watson," he said cordially. "I was afraid you were engaged." "So am I, very much so." "Then I can wait in the next room." "Not at all. This gentleman, Mr. Wilson, has been my partner and helper in many of my most successful cases, and I have no doubt that he will be of the utmost use to me in yours also." The stout gentleman half rose from his chair and gave a bob of a greeting with a quick little questioning glance from his small, fat, encircled eyes. If a story is told from the viewpoint of an outside narrator, not a character in the story, it is told from the third person point of view. The narrator uses the pronouns he, she, and they to discuss the characters. The third person narrator can be subjective or objective. If the narrator describes the inner thoughts and feelings of one or more characters in a story, the narrator is said to be subjective. If the narrator tells the story without describing the thoughts and feelings of any characters in the story, the narrator is said to be objective. Within the subjective point of view, a third-person narrator can be limited or omniscient. In the third-person limited point of view, the narrator of the story reveals the thoughts and feelings of just one character in the story, usually the main character. Although the main character is not telling the story, the reader sees the events of the story as the main character sees them, and the reader understands the inner thoughts and feelings of that main character. In the third-person omniscient point of view, the narrator tells the thoughts and feelings of all characters in the story. The word omniscient means all-knowing or all-seeing. All right, our next point is plot. As you have already learned, the plot of the story is the events that happen in the story from beginning to end. When we describe the plot of a story, we usually draw a plot diagram and refer to the elements of the plot using the following terms: exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. So an exposition is the basic situation the story is introduced. So the reader learns about the characters, setting, background, and conflict, which is the problem of the story. We have our rising action, which is where the conflict deepens, and the reader learns more information about the characters. Events take place that cause the reader to feel the suspense building. The major portion of the story is rising action. Climax, which is when the conflict of the story reaches its peak. The climax is the point of no return, the highest point of action in the story. The climax drives the story to its ending. We have our falling action, which is the action of the story settles down. The falling action shows the result of the climax. And the resolution. The conflict of the story is resolved. The resolution wraps up any loose ends and finishes the story. Here's an example of a typical plot diagram. Okay, and it follows that beautiful path, the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Exposition. Then we have our rising action. Our climax is up here. Our falling action. And our resolution. Ta-da! All right. So in order for a story to have a plot, there must be a conflict that the characters face in the story. There are 4 universal conflicts in literature. We have man versus man, which is the main character or characters is in conflict with one or more people. You read part of O. Henry's short story, The Ransom of Red Chief, in the last unit. In this story, the main characters, Bill and Sam, the kidnappers, are in conflict with the boy they kidnap, who calls himself Red Chief. Instead of the kidnappers terrorizing Red Chief, the boy bullies his kidnappers. And we have man versus nature. The main character is in conflict with the forces of nature, such as tornado, a snowstorm, or an earthquake. In the novel Hatchet, the main character, Brian, is involved in a plane crash that tosses him into the middle of the Canadian wilderness. He must survive in the wilderness alone, and the only tool he has is his hatchet. This novel clearly demonstrates the man versus nature conflict. Man versus self. This conflict involves a character's internal struggle. Often, the character must make a difficult decision or struggles to understand or change something about himself. Lois Lowry's novel, The Giver, shows this type of conflict. The main character, Jonas, must decide whether to stay in his community, where he is promised safety, but he lives his life without freedom to make choices, or to leave his community and go elsewhere, where he will have the freedom to make choices, but must fend for himself. And our final one is man versus society. This conflict places the main character in direct opposition with the society in which he or she lives. The main character disagrees with some aspect of his or her society to the point of taking action against it. The Giver displays this type of conflict as well. Once Jonas realizes that some of the secrets of his community, he understands he must leave the community. He especially resents the fact that the elders of the community make all the decisions for every person in the community, taking away the individual freedom to make choices. A well-written narrative has a consistent point of view through the entire story, well-developed characters, an interesting, engaging plot sequence, and clear conflicts that drive the plot of the story. In the next lesson, you will have an opportunity to practice the writing process by developing an imaginative fictional narrative. Now, here are our questions for this unit, this lesson. So, what is the correct order for the elements of a plot to occur? So that was our fancy little guy with the dragon up there. Okay, match the plot elements with their descriptions. Again, if you scroll back up, you can use this fancy little drop-down menu to tell you which one is correct and which one is not. What are the 4 universal conflicts in literature? You got to select all that apply. True or false? A narrative is an essay where you have several points that support a claim you've made in your thesis statement. Number 5, match the point of view that is used in narratives with the correct description. So again, we have our little drop-down menu, and you can find those answers if you scroll back up. So again, let us know if you have any questions. Let us know if you need any help. That is what we are here for. We are here for you. You are doing an amazing job. You got to keep pushing forward. The thing with online learning is it has to be self-paced, and you have to push yourself. But you can do it. I know you can. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.